The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made the walls feel like they were closing in. The judge had just finished reading the charges against 17-year-old Jada Simmons, a black high school senior accused of a crime that could send her away for life. The prosecutor smirked, adjusting his tie as he turned to the star witness, the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs. "I saw her commit the crime with my own eyes," the officer said with a steady voice. She had the weapon in her hand. There was no mistake. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jada's mother, a single parent who had fought to keep her daughter on the right path, held her face in her hands. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, but none more than Jada herself. She sat at the defense table, her hands gripping the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Briggs' testimony was damning. He was a decorated officer, a respected man in uniform. His word carried weight. The judge listened carefully, nodding. It was over, until Jada spoke. She rose slowly, her lawyer whispering frantically for her to sit back down. But she ignored him. She turned to face the jury, her voice steady. "He's lying." The courtroom stiffened. Jada looked at Sergeant Briggs directly in the eye. "And I can prove it." The officer's face drained of color. The prosecutor's smirk disappeared. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then Jada revealed something that made the entire courtroom gasp. But before anyone could react, chaos erupted. 3 weeks earlier, Jada's life had been perfect. Or at least, as perfect as it could be for a girl growing up in a tough part of the city. She was smart, focused on her dreams, and determined to go to college. She had the grades. She had the talent. She was going to make it out. Her mother, Carla Simmons, worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and pay for Jada's college applications. Every morning, she reminded Jada, "Don't let this world break you. You hear me?" And Jada heard her. That's why she stayed away from trouble, from the gangs, from the drugs. She walked the straight path. She didn't even jaywalk. But trouble had a way of finding people who looked like her. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Jada had just finished basketball practice and was walking home. The sun was setting, and the streets were mostly quiet except for the occasional car passing by. She took a shortcut through a small alley near the grocery store, something she'd done dozens of times before. That's when she heard the commotion. 2 men were arguing near a parked car. Their voices were low but sharp, cutting through the air. She couldn't see them clearly in the dim light, but something about the way one of them kept glancing over his shoulder made her uneasy. Then bang! A gunshot. Jada froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The 2 men scattered like shadows, running in opposite directions. Then she saw him. A man slumped against the car, clutching his chest. Blood spread across his shirt. His eyes flickered up at her, filled with something she couldn't name. Fear? Regret? Jada took a step back. Her heart pounded. She needed to call for help. But before she could move, a police siren wailed down the street. Blue and red lights flashed, bouncing off the walls of the alley. Tires screeched. Then a voice. "Freeze!" She barely had time to turn before she was tackled to the ground. The weight crushed the air from her lungs. Her arms were wrenched behind her back. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. She tried to speak, to explain. "It wasn't me. I just got here. Stay down." The officer's knee pressed harder against her back. Jada struggled to breathe. "Please, Shut up." She heard the radio crackle, heard the officer's voice call in. Suspect apprehended. Weapon recovered. Weapon? Jada blinked against the street lights as the officer lifted something from the ground near her. A gun. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't hers. But she knew right then, none of that would matter. The officer, Sergeant Briggs, dragged her to her feet and shoved her into the back of the police car. As the door slammed shut, she saw the injured man being loaded onto a stretcher. His face was already covered. She didn't even know if he was alive. Tears burned her eyes. She hadn't done anything wrong, but that wouldn't stop them from blaming her. And she was right. The days that followed were a blur of handcuffs, interrogations, and whispered conversations between lawyers and prosecutors. Jada's public defender, a tired-looking man named Mr. Reynolds, told her, "They're saying they have a witness." "A cop. This isn't looking good, Jada." She told him the truth. "I didn't do it." He sighed. "Then we'll fight. But I won't lie to you. It's an uphill battle." Her mother visited every chance she could. She held Jada's hands through the bars and whispered, "Baby, I believe you." But belief wasn't enough in a courtroom. The trial began fast. Too fast. The prosecution painted Jada as a troubled teen, someone who had fallen in with the wrong crowd. They played up the danger she supposedly posed, mentioning her neighborhood, her friends, even the way she dressed. Then came Sergeant Briggs. He took the stand, looking sharp in his uniform, his badge catching the light. His voice was strong, confident. I saw the suspect fleeing the scene. She had the weapon in her right hand. Jada's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't run. She didn't have the gun. But Briggs continued, never once looking in her direction. She tried to dispose of the weapon when I ordered her to stop, but I secured it before she could get rid of the evidence. Lie, lie, lie. Jada's lawyer objected, demanded proof, but Briggs was the proof. A cop's word against the black teens? The jury barely looked at her. The case was falling apart, until she stood up in court and said, "He's lying, and I can prove it." The courtroom sucked in a breath. Sergeant Briggs' face went stiff. The judge sat up straighter. The jury leaned forward. Jada locked eyes with the officer. Then she dropped the bombshell that turned the entire trial upside down. The room erupted. People shouted. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. But the damage was done. Jada had just changed everything. The courtroom was in chaos. People whispered, gasped, and some even stood up, craning their necks to get a better look at Jada. The judge slammed his gavel down hard. Order. Order in the court. Slowly, the noise died down, but the energy in the room was different now. Charged. Tense. Jada stood tall. She could feel her lawyer staring at her, wide-eyed. He hadn't expected this. Neither had the prosecutor. But the person who looked the most rattled was Sergeant Briggs. His jaw was clenched. His fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles were turning white. The judge leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose. "Ms. Simmons, this is highly unusual. Are you saying you have evidence that contradicts Sergeant Briggs' testimony?" Jada took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I can prove that he's lying." The judge turned to the defense attorney. "Mr. Reynolds, is your client prepared to present this evidence?" Reynolds hesitated. He had no idea what Jada was about to do. This wasn't part of the plan, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't backing down. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Jada turned back to the jury. "I never held that gun," she said. "I never even saw it until it was in Briggs' hands." The prosecutor scoffed. "That's not what the officer said." Jada ignored him. "But I can prove he wasn't telling the truth. Because at the moment he claims I was holding that weapon, I was texting my mom." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jada turned to her lawyer. "Check my phone records." Reynolds blinked. Then his eyes widened as he understood what she was saying. He quickly grabbed his files, flipping through the paperwork they had barely looked at. The prosecution had already dismissed Jada's phone records as unimportant. After all, they didn't show a call to 911 or anything useful for her defense. But now, Reynolds found what he was looking for and walked toward the judge. "Your Honor, we request an immediate review of the defendant's phone records." The prosecutor stood. "Objection. This is a desperate attempt to delay proceedings. The phone records are irrelevant." The judge narrowed his eyes. "I'll decide that." "Overruled. Let me see them." Reynolds handed over the papers. The judge scanned them. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "It says here that at exactly 7:32 p.m., the defendant sent a text message to her mother," the judge said. "Sergeant Briggs, your report states that you saw the defendant holding the weapon at—" Briggs shifted in his seat. 7:32 p.m. The room was deathly silent. The prosecutor's face drained of color. Briggs swallowed hard. She could have been texting before or after she... Jada cut him off. "No, because I was still typing when I heard the gunshot." She looked at the judge. "I never stopped moving my thumbs. There's no way I could have been holding a gun." The judge considered this for a long moment. "Is there proof that the message was actively being typed at that exact time?" Reynolds stepped in. "Yes, Your Honor. If we can gain access to the defendant's phone." The metadata will confirm the typing activity. Briggs looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge sighed and turned to the prosecution. Do you have any objections? The prosecutor hesitated. He knew that if they checked the phone and Jada was telling the truth, his entire case would fall apart. But saying no would make them look like they were hiding something. No objections, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then the court will take a short recess while we verify this evidence. The gavel slammed down. The courtroom erupted again. Jada was led back to a holding room with her lawyer. The moment they were alone, Reynolds turned to her. What the hell was that? He whispered. She shrugged. The truth. Reynolds ran a hand through his thinning hair. Jada, you just shook up this entire case. If your phone records check out, they're going to have a lot of explaining to do. Jada nodded. She had known from the moment she got arrested that she had been set up. Briggs was lying. But now, for the first time, she felt like she might actually have a chance to prove it. Minutes passed like hours. Then the door opened. A court officer stepped in. They verified the metadata. Jada's heart stopped. And Reynolds asked. The officer hesitated. Then he sighed. She's telling the truth. The courtroom was buzzing when Jada and Reynolds walked back in. The judge looked serious as he addressed the court. The metadata confirms that Ms. Simmons was actively typing a message at the exact time Sergeant Briggs claims she was holding a weapon. This directly contradicts his testimony. Gasps filled the room. Jada turned to look at Briggs. His face was pale. His hands were clenched. He knew. He knew he had just been caught. The judge leaned back in his chair. Given this revelation, I am ordering an immediate review of the arresting officer's conduct. Furthermore, but before he could finish, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a suit stormed inside, flanked by two uniformed officers. He had sharp eyes and a hard expression. He walked straight to the prosecution's table and whispered something to the lead prosecutor. Then he turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, I'm Agent Monroe with Internal Affairs, and I believe this case is about to get much bigger than just one false testimony. The air in the courtroom changed. Jada's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom, already tense, now felt like a bomb about to explode. Agent Monroe, the Internal Affairs officer, stood in the middle of the room like he owned it. His presence changed everything. Sergeant Briggs looked frozen, his face rigid with something between anger and fear. Jada clenched her fists. What was happening? The judge adjusted his glasses and frowned. Agent Monroe, this is a highly unusual interruption. What is the meaning of this? Monroe didn't hesitate. Your Honor, we have been conducting an ongoing investigation into Sergeant Daniel Briggs for several months now. He turned toward the jury, then toward the crowd. We have reason to believe that this officer has fabricated evidence in multiple cases, including this one. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jada's mother, sitting in the front row, clapped a hand over her mouth. Sergeant Briggs shot up from his chair. This is ridiculous. The judge slammed his gavel. You will sit down, Sergeant. Briggs hesitated, breathing hard, before finally sinking back into his seat. But his hands were shaking. Monroe continued. Our team reviewed arrest records, body cam footage, and witness statements. We found a pattern, cases where evidence appeared out of nowhere, where testimonies changed at the last minute. We believe that Sergeant Briggs has been framing young black men and women for years. Jada's chest tightened. Years? How many people had this man sent away? The prosecutor looked rattled. This is outrageous. If you had this information, why wait until now? Monroe turned to him, his face cold. Because we didn't have proof. But now we do. He gestured toward Jada. Thanks to Ms. Simmons' testimony and the phone records, we have our first undeniable case of perjury. The room erupted into murmurs again. Jada could barely process what was happening. She had known Briggs was lying, but she had no idea this ran deeper than just her case. The judge rubbed his temples. What exactly are you requesting, Agent Monroe? Monroe stepped forward. We request that the trial be suspended immediately. The charges against Ms. Simmons should be dismissed. Additionally, we are placing Sergeant Briggs under official investigation for misconduct. Briggs jumped up again. This is a setup, he yelled. His voice cracked. And for the first time, Jada saw real panic in his eyes. This girl is guilty. Before he could finish, Monroe pulled something from his pocket and held it up. A USB drive. He walked toward the judge's bench and handed it over. Your Honor, this drive contains audio recordings of Sergeant Briggs admitting to planting evidence. The prosecutor's face went pale. The judge turned back to Briggs. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Sergeant? Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was done. The judge sighed heavily. I will review this evidence, but as of now, I am dismissing all charges against Jada Simmons. Tears sprang to Jada's eyes. She was free. Her mother let out a sob of relief. But before Jada could even process what had happened, Monroe turned to her. There's one more thing. Jada's breath caught in her throat. What now? Monroe glanced around the courtroom, making sure everyone was listening. The man who was shot that night, the one Jada was accused of harming. He took a deep breath. We believe he knew the truth about Briggs, and that's why someone wanted him dead. The room went silent. Jada's stomach twisted. Monroe looked straight at her. You weren't just framed, Jada. You were a loose end. And just like that, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jada's head was spinning. She had fought to prove her innocence. But now Monroe was saying that this went deeper than just her case. Someone had set her up, not just to take the fall, but to be erased, to be silenced. A shiver ran through her. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with noise, fell eerily silent as Monroe's words sank in. The judge stared at the agent. What exactly are you saying, Agent Monroe? Monroe's jaw tightened. I'm saying this wasn't just a case of a bad cop lying to get a conviction. The man who was shot that night, Terrence Lewis, was a known informant. He was working with internal affairs to help expose dirty cops. Monroe let the weight of those words settle before continuing. We believe Sergeant Briggs and possibly others were involved in his shooting. The entire courtroom erupted. Jada's mother gasped loudly, clutching her chest. The prosecutor slammed his hands on the table. This is nonsense. You're making wild accusations with no. Monroe turned to him, his voice calm but firm. We already have an open case. This isn't a theory. It's an ongoing investigation. Jada's breath hitched. Wait, she interrupted. Are you saying that the real shooter is still out there? Monroe looked at her, his eyes unreadable. Yes. The room fell deathly silent again. Jada felt her knees go weak. She had spent the last few weeks thinking she was just a victim of a corrupt cop. But now, she realized she had been marked for something much worse. The judge rubbed his temples. We're getting far beyond the scope of this case. He turned to Monroe. What do you need? Monroe sighed. First, we need to take Sergeant Briggs into custody immediately. The judge nodded. Bailiff. Before Briggs could react, 2 officers moved in and grabbed him. He thrashed. You can't do this. You have no idea who you're messing with. But the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Jada watched as they dragged him toward the back exit. Just before he disappeared from sight, he turned his head and locked eyes with her. The look in his eyes made her stomach drop. He wasn't afraid. He was furious. And something about the way he smirked just before he vanished sent ice through her veins. Something wasn't right. Monroe must have noticed because he immediately turned to the judge. Your Honor, given what we know, we request witness protection for Ms. Simmons. Jada's heart pounded. Witness protection? Her mother shot up. What? You're saying my baby still isn't safe? Monroe hesitated. Want to know how deep this goes, ma'am? If Jada was framed, then whoever did it might still see her as a threat. Jada felt like she was suffocating. She had fought so hard to get free. Now, they were saying she had to go into hiding? I can't, she said, shaking her head. I can't just disappear. My life. Monroe gave her a sympathetic look. Your life is exactly what they want to take. Jada's stomach twisted. The judge turned to her lawyer. Mr. Reynolds, do you and your client need a moment? Reynolds sighed and nodded. He leaned down, whispering to Jada. I know this is a lot, but you need to listen to them. If they think you're in danger, you probably are. Jada swallowed hard. Her mother grabbed her hand. Baby, whatever we have to do to keep you safe, we'll do it. Jada looked at Monroe. How long would I have to stay in witness protection? Monroe hesitated. Until we find out who really shot Terrence Lewis. Jada exhaled shakily. She had no choice. She nodded. Okay. Monroe gave her a firm nod. We'll move fast. Tonight, you and your mother will be taken somewhere safe. Jada took a deep breath. She had won her freedom, only to be sent into hiding. But she wasn't just going to sit back and wait. If someone had tried to frame her for murder, she was going to find out who, and they were going to pay. That night, Jada and her mother packed their bags under the watchful eyes of 2 federal agents. They were given burner phones and told to avoid contacting anyone from their old life. By midnight, they were on the road. Jada watched the city lights fade in the distance, her chest tightening. She had been innocent. She had fought to prove it. But something told her this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, because someone had gone through a lot of trouble to frame her, and they weren't going to just let her walk away. The car had been driving for hours when Jada's burner phone buzzed. She frowned. Only Monroe had the number. She pulled it out, hesitating, then answered. Hello. Silence. Then, a deep, distorted voice. You should have stayed in jail, Jada. The call ended. Jada's heart nearly stopped. Someone had found her number, and they were watching. She wasn't safe. Not even close. Jada's hands shook as she stared at the phone. The number was blocked. No caller ID. Her stomach twisted. How? How did they get her number? She was in witness protection. Only Monroe and a handful of trusted agents knew where she was. Her mother, sitting beside her in the back seat of the car, must have noticed her expression because she reached over and touched her arm. Jada. Jada's throat was dry. She couldn't answer. Instead, she turned the phone toward Monroe, who sat in the passenger seat in front of them. Monroe grabbed the phone, his face hardening. What did they say? Jada forced herself to speak. They said, I should have stayed in jail. Monroe's jaw tightened. The 2 agents in the front exchanged glances. Then the driver, Agent Carter, reached for his radio. We've got a breach. Someone has her number. Jada felt like she couldn't breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be safe. Monroe turned in his seat to face her. Jada, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're changing locations. No more phones. Not even the burner. Jada clenched her fists. How did they find me? Monroe didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the other agents. There's only one explanation, he said, his voice low. Someone on the inside leaked it. Jada's heart dropped. A traitor. Someone inside law enforcement. Someone who was supposed to protect her. Had given her information to the people who wanted her dead. Her mother covered her mouth, eyes wide with fear. You mean we can't trust anyone? Monroe exhaled sharply. Not until we figure out who's behind this. The tension in the car was suffocating. Jada turned to the window, staring into the dark. The highway stretched ahead, long and empty, swallowed by the night. The call had changed everything. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was being hunted. And the worst part? They were already 1 step ahead. 2 hours later, they arrived at a motel off a deserted road. It was the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the vending machine was half broken. Monroe checked the place before waving them inside. Jada sat on the bed while her mother paced the room, rubbing her hands together. This isn't right, her mother whispered. We're supposed to be safe. Monroe sighed. I know, but until we figure out who's leaking information, we need to stay low. Jada clenched her jaw. And what if they find us again? Monroe hesitated. They won't. But his eyes told a different story. Jada saw the way his fingers hovered near his gun, the way his shoulders were tense. He was expecting trouble, and so was she. That night, Jada couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Someone had framed her. Someone had killed Terrence Lewis and tried to pin it on her. And now, that same someone was still after her. She needed answers. She wasn't going to just sit back and hide. She had been fighting since the day she was arrested. And she wasn't stopping now. Carefully, she reached for Monroe's laptop, which was sitting on the small motel desk. He had left it there while making calls outside. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, until she found it. A list of all the officers involved in the original case against her. Briggs was the main one, but there were others, and one name stood out. Detective Paul Riggins. Jada's breath caught in her throat. Her lawyer had mentioned his name once, briefly. He was one of the first officers on the scene that night. But something was off. She quickly searched his name, clicking through files Monroe had access to. And she found something that made her blood run cold. Riggins had a history. Excessive force complaints. Cases that mysteriously disappeared. And worst of all, he had been partners with Briggs. Jada's heart pounded. Briggs was behind bars. But what if Riggins wasn't just another dirty cop? What if he was the one still pulling the strings? Her fingers trembled as she closed the laptop. She needed to tell Monroe. She turned and stopped. The window was open. A cold breeze slipped through the room. Jada's stomach twisted. She hadn't opened it. She stood up slowly, every hair on her body standing on end. Then, a noise. A faint creak. Someone was in the motel room with her. Jada's blood turned to ice. She wasn't alone. And whoever was there wasn't a friend. Jada's heart raced in her chest as she scanned the room, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The faint sound of movement came again, a soft shuffle, like a boot scuffing against the floor. She couldn't see anyone, but she felt them. Her breath hitched in her throat. She didn't know if it was paranoia or if something was truly off, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She stepped cautiously toward the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible, her feet barely making a sound on the old carpet. She reached for the handle, but stopped. There was something about the air in the room. It felt thicker, more dangerous. She turned her head, her eyes narrowing. The curtains. Her pulse spiked. The window had been open. She could feel the cold breeze rushing in, but there was no way she would have opened it without noticing. And no one had mentioned it being cracked. Had someone been watching them? The sound of breathing, barely audible, snapped her attention back to the room. It wasn't her mother. Her mother was pacing the other side of the room, wringing her hands. The noise wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the shadows by the far corner, right next to the bed. Jada's hand hovered near the gun Monroe had left on the dresser. She couldn't hear footsteps, but she knew she had to act quickly. The room felt too quiet. Then the creak of the floorboards behind her was unmistakable. She spun around, her eyes wide. The room was empty. But just as she relaxed, the sound came again. Someone was definitely in here. Without warning, Jada grabbed the gun and turned, aiming at the corner. A figure moved from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered. He was dressed in dark clothing, a black hoodie covering his face. Jada's finger tightened on the trigger. "Who are you?" The man froze. For a heartbeat, the world felt like it had come to a standstill. Jada's pulse pounded in her ears, and her breath was shallow as she kept the gun trained on the figure. But then, the man spoke. "Put the gun down, Jada." His voice was deep, calm, but there was something about it that sent chills down her spine. "How do you know my name?" Jada demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. He stepped forward slowly. "Monroe's been expecting you. He just didn't know it would be like this." The words made no sense. Monroe had left her alone for only a few minutes to make a phone call outside. How did this man know she was here? And why did he sound so familiar? "Who sent you?" she asked, her gun still aimed. The man hesitated, then took another step forward. "We're on the same side. But right now, you don't have time to question me." Jada felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. "I'm not going to hurt you, Jada, but I need you to listen to me." She narrowed her eyes. "How do I know I can trust you?" He stopped just out of reach. "Because I'm trying to keep you alive." Jada kept her eyes trained on him. She didn't lower the gun, but she also didn't pull the trigger. There was something in his voice that made her hesitate, something that made her wonder if she had more in common with this stranger than she realized. "I know you think I'm the enemy," he said, "but we're both after the same thing. The truth about Terrence Lewis and the people who want you dead." Her breath hitched. He knew. He knew about Terrence. She hadn't told anyone outside of Monroe about what happened that night. Her heart was pounding as she spoke. "Who are you?" The man exhaled sharply. "My name's Daniel Riggins." Jada's world seemed to stop. Riggins? The same name she had found in the files earlier. The name that had stood out in the list of corrupt officers she had uncovered. Daniel Riggins. But there was something wrong about this. Her mind raced. "You're the cop who—" He held up his hands. "I know what you're thinking, But hear me out. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading for her to listen. I'm not like Briggs. I never wanted any of this. I'm not involved in framing you. And I sure as hell didn't want Terrence to die. But I'm in deep, and I'm trying to help you find out who's really behind all this before it's too late. Jada's hands were trembling, but she kept the gun steady. Then why are you here? He looked down, like he didn't want to say the next part. Because, Jada, if you stay with Monroe, you're not going to make it. Whoever's behind all this, they already know about him. They know where he is. They know you're with him. Her blood ran cold. Monroe's not safe? Riggins nodded. No one is. They have eyes on every move we make. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The figure she had been hunting, the person who had framed her, was now hunting her, and Monroe. The situation was spiraling faster than she could understand. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and Monroe rushed in. The tension was palpable. He froze when he saw Riggins standing in front of Jada, his hands still raised. Riggins, Monroe said sharply, his voice low but dangerous. What the hell are you doing here? Riggins didn't flinch. I came to help her. Monroe's eyes narrowed. You came to help her? Or you came to make sure she doesn't find out who you really are? The question hit Jada like a slap. Monroe knew something. Riggins turned to her. Jada, he's not who he says he is. Monroe's eyes flicked toward Jada. Don't listen to him. He's working with the people who want you gone. Jada's heart raced. The world around her was closing in. She couldn't trust either of them. She had to decide. But which one was telling the truth? The room was thick with tension. Jada's mind raced, unable to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. She stood frozen between Monroe and Riggins, each man looking at her like he had the answers, but she wasn't sure which one she should trust. Monroe's voice was sharp. Jada, you need to listen to me. Riggins is not a good guy. He's part of the mess, and if you go with him, you'll be walking straight into a trap. Riggins smirked, shaking his head. Monroe's lying, Jada. He's been playing both sides from the start. I can prove it. Jada's pulse quickened. Every word, every accusation seemed like it was pushing her deeper into a maze she couldn't get out of. But something in Riggins's eyes, something she couldn't explain, made her second-guess everything Monroe had said. Why should I believe you? She finally managed, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. She still held the gun, her finger itching against the trigger, unsure if either man was a friend or foe. Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already, Riggins replied calmly, his hands still raised, as if trying to show her he wasn't a threat. Monroe took a step forward, but Jada quickly raised the gun, her eyes fixed on him now. Don't come any closer, Monroe. What's going on? For a moment, there was only silence. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as Jada's mind raced. Both men seemed desperate, but why? I'm not your enemy, Jada, Monroe said quietly, his tone softer now. I've been trying to protect you from the beginning, and I was trying to get to the truth about who framed you and why. But it's bigger than just some bad cop. Bigger, Jada repeated, her mind spinning. What do you mean? Monroe hesitated. There's a whole network of dirty cops, Jada. Not just Briggs. It's a group, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure the truth never gets out. They'll kill anyone who gets too close, even us. Jada glanced at Riggins. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his presence that made her question Monroe's story. No, you're not telling me everything, she said. If this is all true, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me walk into this mess? Monroe flinched, and for a moment, his resolve wavered. Because it wasn't safe, Jada. If I had told you everything from the start, you would have been a target. But now you've been dragged into this whether you like it or not. The people behind this are coming for you. Jada swallowed hard. Everything she thought she knew about her situation was slipping away, and she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Riggins stepped forward cautiously. Monroe's right about one thing. There's a group of corrupt officers, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way. But I'm not one of them. I'm not working with them, and I'm not trying to hurt you. In fact, I'm the only one who knows how to get to the heart of this and bring them down. Jada blinked, torn. The words felt like a lifeline, but they also felt dangerous. If Riggins was telling the truth, he was her only hope. But if he was lying, she might be walking straight into a trap. She looked between the two men, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Her mind was clouded with doubt, but one thing was clear. If she didn't make a decision soon, she could end up dead. "I need time to think," she said, lowering the gun slightly but not entirely. Monroe's eyes softened. "You don't have time, Jada. These people are fast, and they have more resources than you can imagine. If we don't move now, you might not make it through the night." Jada felt her head spin. Time was running out, and every second felt like an eternity. She couldn't let fear cloud her judgment, but how could she make the right choice when both men had so much to gain from her decision? "Jada," Riggins said, his voice steady, "you're not the only one being hunted. I am too. I can't go back to the life I had. I'm trying to fix the mess I helped create. But you need to trust me now. We need to stick together if we're going to survive." There was a rawness in his voice that made her pause. He wasn't speaking with the usual confidence of a man in control. For the first time, Jada saw a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes, and it made her reconsider everything she thought she knew. Monroe, however, wasn't giving up so easily. "Jada, I've been on your side from the start. I've been working to bring these people down, and you don't know how much danger you're in. You can't trust him." Jada's mind swirled. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, but something told her that she had to make a choice. She couldn't afford to stand still anymore. "I'm going with Riggins," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Monroe's face hardened instantly. "You don't know what you're getting into, Jada. If you go with him, you're on your own." Jada nodded slowly. She wasn't naive. She knew what Riggins had said wasn't guaranteed, but something about his desperation to help her, his willingness to be open and honest, made her feel like she had no other option. Monroe's expression twisted with anger and frustration, but he didn't try to stop her. "Fine. You made your choice." He stormed toward the door. Before he left, he turned back to her, his eyes cold. "You'll regret this, Jada. You'll see." The door slammed shut behind him, and Jada exhaled a breath she didn't even realize she was holding. Riggins took a step toward her, his eyes softening. "You did the right thing. But now, we need to move quickly. There's no time to waste." Jada nodded, steeling herself for whatever came next. She wasn't sure she could trust Riggins completely, but right now, he was her only hope. She followed him out the door, the sound of Monroe's angry footsteps echoing in her mind as she stepped into the unknown. They were leaving the motel behind, but there was no escaping the truth. Someone was out there hunting her, and she couldn't run from it anymore. It was time to fight back. The air outside was cool, a stark contrast to the tense heat that had settled in Jada's chest. Riggins led the way, his movements quick and purposeful as he glanced over his shoulder every few seconds. Jada's heart still raced from the confrontation with Monroe, but now that she had made her decision, there was no turning back. She was already in this mess too deep. They were in a small, abandoned parking lot behind the motel, with only a handful of rusted cars littered around. Riggins didn't speak as he ushered her toward an old, nondescript sedan parked in the corner. The windows were tinted black, and the car looked like it hadn't been used in years. Jada hesitated. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Riggins said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "We'll talk once we're there." Jada nodded, her mind still buzzing. She could feel the weight of her decision bearing down on her, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. If Riggins was lying, she'd deal with that later. But right now, she needed to trust him, or else she would never get the answer she was looking for. The car ride was silent, the only sound coming from the hum of the engine as Riggins maneuvered the car through the dark streets. Jada kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, her heart still pounding in her chest, waiting for someone to tail them. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the world itself had conspired to hide her from whoever was hunting her. After what felt like an eternity, Riggins finally turned onto a winding, narrow road that seemed to lead further into the woods. The lights of the city disappeared behind them, replaced by the thick, dark trees that seemed to swallow the road whole. "We're almost there," Riggins muttered, his voice tense. Jada tried to steady her breathing, her mind still racing. What had she gotten herself into? She had just walked away from Monroe, someone she had trusted, And now she was following a man who had been part of the system that nearly destroyed her. It didn't feel right, but there was no other choice. The car came to a stop in front of an old, run-down cabin, the kind of place that looked abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was chipped and peeling. "Stay close," Riggins instructed as he pulled the keys from the ignition. Jada's stomach twisted as she followed him out of the car. There was something unnerving about this place. It looked like it hadn't seen any human activity in years. She kept her hand on the gun tucked in the waistband of her jeans, her mind still on high alert. Riggins led her up the creaky stairs to the front door, which he unlocked with a key from his pocket. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit interior. It was empty except for a few pieces of furniture that had clearly seen better days. A couch sat against one wall, covered in dust, and an old lamp flickered weakly from the corner. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and age. Jada stepped inside, looking around, her nerves fraying with every passing second. This didn't feel safe, not like Riggins had promised. "I know it's not much," Riggins said, breaking her thoughts. "But it'll do for now. We have to lay low until we figure out our next move." Jada didn't respond right away. Her instincts were telling her to leave, to get back in the car and run, but she couldn't. Not without answers. And if Riggins was telling the truth, then this place was the only shot she had left at finding them. "So, what now?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her stomach. Riggins looked at her, his face serious. "Now, we find out who's behind this. I have a few connections that can help us dig into the people who framed you. But we have to be careful. There are eyes everywhere. The people who set you up are watching you." Jada nodded. "And Monroe? What happens to him?" Riggins didn't answer immediately, his eyes flickering to the door. "Monroe has his own agenda. He's been working against the same people for a long time, but I'm not sure how much I trust him. I know he wants to protect you, but I'm not sure how far he's willing to go." Jada felt a pang of guilt. Monroe had always been on her side, hadn't he? He was the one who had fought to get her out of jail, the one who had believed her when no one else would. But now, the more she thought about it, the more Riggins's words rang true. Maybe Monroe hadn't been completely honest with her. "Right now, we can't worry about him," Riggins continued. "We need to focus on keeping you alive." Jada's mind raced. She had come here hoping for answers, but instead, she was more confused than ever. How could she trust either of them? Monroe had said things that made sense, and Riggins, well, he was the only one who had offered her any real hope. But was that enough? Riggins handed her a small file folder. "These are the people who've been involved in the frame job. If you want to understand who's behind this, you need to know their names." Jada took the folder, her fingers brushing against the cool paper. She opened it, revealing a list of names, photographs, and criminal records. One name stood out to her immediately: Detective Paul Riggins. Her breath caught in her throat. "Wait, this is you," she said, looking up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why is your name on this list?" Riggins's face tightened. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was low. "Because that's who I was. But that's not who I am anymore." Jada felt like the floor had fallen out from under her. Everything she thought she knew about him, everything, was starting to unravel. But if Riggins was involved with these people, how could she trust him? She gripped the folder tightly. "So, you're telling me you used to work with these people? You were one of them?" Riggins's jaw clenched. "I was. But I'm out. I'm trying to take them down. The person who framed you, he's not working alone. He's part of a much bigger operation. And right now, the biggest threat to you is the same person who framed you. The man who killed Terrence Lewis." Jada's heart dropped. "You mean they're still out there?" Riggins nodded grimly. "And they'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't find out the truth. But we'll get there, Jada. We have to." Jada stared at the names and pictures in the file, her mind spinning with the realization that the people who had framed her were still hunting her. And now, she was caught in the middle of something much darker than she ever could have imagined. And the worst part? She had no idea who to trust anymore. Jada's mind was spinning, and her head throbbed with confusion. She stared at the file in her hands, the photographs of crooked cops and corrupt officials swimming in front of her eyes. Detective Paul Riggins. She had trusted him, and now, everything she knew about him and about the world she was living in was beginning to crumble. How could she trust him after everything he had just revealed? How could she trust anyone? Jada. Riggins's voice broke through her whirlwind of thoughts. He was watching her closely, his eyes steady but filled with something she couldn't place. "Why should I believe you?" she finally asked, her voice small but firm. She had to know if he was truly on her side, or if he was just another player in the game that had nearly destroyed her life. Riggins looked at her, a mixture of guilt and determination in his expression. "Because I'm trying to stop them. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm not part of the system anymore. I was wrong, Jada. I realize that now. I've seen too much, and I can't just keep turning a blind eye." Jada felt a heavy weight in her chest as she stared at him. His words seemed sincere, but could she really believe him? Could she believe anyone anymore? She glanced down at the file again, her fingers brushing the edges of the photographs. There were people in the file, cops, officials, even business people, all connected in some way to the scheme that had framed her and likely dozens of others. These were the people who had worked to destroy lives for power, for control. These were the people who had nearly destroyed hers. But who exactly was in charge? Who's at the top? Jada asked, her voice quieter now, filled with the quiet urgency of someone who finally realized the depth of the situation. "Who's pulling all the strings?" Riggins hesitated, then finally spoke. "There's a name that keeps coming up. A man who's been behind everything for years. His name is Anthony Cartwright." Jada's eyes narrowed. She had never heard of him. "Who is he?" she asked. Riggins sat down on the couch across from her, looking like he was weighing every word before speaking. "Cartwright is untouchable. He's a businessman, but not in the normal sense. He owns a lot of properties and a lot of people. But it's not just about money for him. He's built an empire of influence, corruption, and fear. He controls people, cops, politicians, judges. It's all connected." Jada absorbed the information, her brain churning. A businessman, a puppeteer behind a corrupt system. It was the perfect cover. She had to learn everything she could about this man. He was the key to everything. "I need to know where to find him," she said, her voice steely with purpose. Riggins looked at her, and for a moment, there was a flash of concern in his eyes. "You don't know what you're asking. Cartwright is dangerous. If you go after him, you're not just putting yourself in danger, you're putting everyone you care about at risk." Jada swallowed hard, her mind made up. "I've already lost everything. I'm already in danger. But if I don't find him, if I don't stop him, who will?" Riggins exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment. Then he nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. You're already in the thick of it. But this isn't something you can just walk away from. If Cartwright sees you as a threat, he won't hesitate. And there's no one who can protect you from him. Not me, not Monroe, not anyone." Jada clenched her fists, determination flooding her body. "Then I'll have to protect myself." The quiet tension in the room hung heavy, as if everything had suddenly shifted. Riggins didn't say anything more, but his eyes lingered on Jada, filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "Okay," he said finally, "we'll do this together. But you need to know, you're not just fighting one man. You're going up against a whole network. And it's going to get worse before it gets better." Jada nodded. "I'm ready." She glanced at the file again. "Where do we start?" Riggins stood up, moving toward a small table where a map of the city was spread out. He tapped a point on the map. "Cartwright's headquarters is here. It's in an old warehouse district, private property, heavily guarded. But there's a back entrance. If we're going to get in and get out without alerting his people, that's our best shot." Jada leaned over the table, studying the map. Her eyes locked on the warehouse. She could feel the weight of the plan, the danger that loomed ahead. But she was already too deep to back out now. She had a goal. She had to stop Anthony Cartwright. He was the one who had orchestrated her downfall, and now he would pay. "I'll need to get closer," she said, her voice low but filled with purpose. "I need to learn everything about this place. Who's guarding it? Who's involved?" Riggins's eyes flicked to her. "You want to go undercover?" Jada nodded. I'm not going in blind. I'm not going to get myself killed over this. We're doing it smart. Riggins studied her for a long moment. Finally, he gave a curt nod. You're right. We'll need to blend in. I can get us some resources, some inside contacts. But you need to be prepared. If Cartwright gets wind of what you're doing, it'll be too late. Jada took a deep breath, her nerves steeling. She was already in this fight, and she wouldn't let fear stop her. I'll do whatever it takes, she said firmly. I'm not walking away from this. Not now. Riggins nodded again, his gaze shifting toward the door. All right, we start tomorrow. You'll need a new look, a different identity. Jada smiled grimly. I've got plenty of practice pretending to be someone I'm not. They shared a brief look, both understanding the weight of what was to come. Tomorrow would be the first step into the lion's den. But Jada had made her choice. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting, and she was going to bring Anthony Cartwright down. The following morning was eerily quiet, and the atmosphere in the cabin felt heavier than before. The stillness was suffocating as Jada and Riggins went over the plan. Time was of the essence. The deeper they got into this operation, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back now. The battle lines had been drawn, and the only thing left to do was fight. Jada sat at the small table, sipping water from a plastic bottle while she went through the folder Riggins had given her. She had memorized every detail about the people connected to Anthony Cartwright, but she knew she couldn't waste any more time. Riggins entered the room, a small bag in his hand. This is your new look, he said, setting it down on the table. Jada opened the bag to find a set of clothes and a few accessories, a black leather jacket, a pair of dark sunglasses, and a wig. She raised an eyebrow. You think I need to change my whole look? Riggins gave her a wry smile. We can't risk anyone recognizing you, Jada. You're no longer just a victim. They'll be looking for you. And if we're going to infiltrate Cartwright's operation, you need to blend in. This isn't just about hiding. It's about becoming someone else. Jada hesitated, but knew he was right. The world she had once known, the life she had fought so hard to keep, was gone. If she was going to take down Cartwright and his empire, she had to leave her old identity behind. She looked at herself in the mirror after putting on the wig. The change was striking. The sleek black hair framed her face perfectly, and a leather jacket gave her an air of toughness. She wasn't Jada Simmons anymore. She was someone new, someone who could walk into Cartwright's world and make them believe she belonged. I look the part, she said, adjusting her sunglasses. Riggins nodded, though there was a sharpness in his gaze. You do. But remember, it's not just about the clothes. Your mindset has to change, too. You can't afford to hesitate when it's time to act. They won't give you a second chance. Jada felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't naive enough to think this was going to be easy. She was walking into the lion's den, and if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't make it out alive. The plan was straightforward but risky. They would get as close to Cartwright's operation as possible, learn everything they could, and if they were lucky, get the evidence they needed to bring him down. Riggins had contacts who could help them access the information they needed, but every move they made had to be precise. One misstep, and they would be caught. I'll keep the car ready, Riggins said as he started to head out the door. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. Jada nodded. She had to trust him, and right now, trusting Riggins was the only option she had. She had no idea how long they would be able to stay hidden, or how much time they had before Cartwright found out what they were doing. But she was ready to play her part in this game, and if it meant putting everything on the line, so be it. 10 minutes later, Jada stepped out into the cool morning air, the sun just starting to rise in the distance. She could hear Riggins's car idling a short distance away, its engine humming in the otherwise quiet surroundings. As she slid into the passenger seat, Riggins shot her a quick, calculating glance. You good? Jada nodded, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. She wasn't good, but she wasn't going to back down either. I'm good, she said. All right, Riggins replied. He put the car in gear and drove down the winding road, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror constantly. The tense silence between them spoke volumes. They both knew that one wrong move could end everything. They made their way toward the heart of the city, and the closer they got to Cartwright's operation, the more Jada felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. They were getting closer to the man who had caused all of this. The man who had tried to destroy her life. And if she was lucky, today would be the day she learned everything she needed to finally take him down. They stopped at a nondescript cafe on the edge of downtown. It was busy, but quiet enough to blend in. A woman behind the counter gave Riggins a knowing look as they entered, her eyes flickering to Jada before returning to her work. Riggins led Jada to a small table near the back, where a man was already waiting for them. He was well-dressed, his face hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses despite the overcast weather outside. As soon as he saw Riggins, he gave a nod and motioned for them to sit. "This is Nick," Riggins introduced. "He's a contact. He can get us the information we need, but we have to be careful. If Cartwright's people are on to us, Nick won't be able to help us for long." Jada sat down, her eyes scanning the room. The cafe was quiet, but the air felt thick with tension. The man across from them, Nick, didn't speak right away. He just studied Jada for a moment, his gaze assessing. Finally, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You sure you want to do this?" Jada didn't hesitate. "Yes, I need to know everything about Cartwright. Where he's hiding, who his people are, and what he's planning next." Nick gave her a sharp look, then turned to Riggins. "This won't be easy. Cartwright's network is vast. We're talking dozens of people, and some of them are untouchable. But I've got eyes on him. I can get you information, but you'll need to be patient." Jada didn't flinch. "I've waited long enough." Nick studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and slid it across the table to Jada. "This is the start. I got a list of people close to Cartwright. Find out who you can trust. The rest," he trailed off, his eyes dark. "Get them before they get you." Jada took the paper, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Every name on that list was a potential lead, a potential link to Cartwright's empire. She folded the paper carefully and stuffed it into her pocket, her gaze focused. "We'll be back for more," she said. Nick gave a small nod. "Don't take too long. Things are getting hot, and Cartwright's not someone you want to keep waiting." With that, Riggins stood, followed by Jada. They made their way back to the car in silence. As they drove away from the cafe, Jada's mind raced. She had a list of people who could either help her take down Cartwright or kill her in the process. She wasn't going to stop now. No matter what it took, she was going to bring down the man who had destroyed everything she had. The city felt different now. Every street, every corner, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Jada kept her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for anyone who might be following them. The world was too quiet, too still, and the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on her chest. Riggins didn't speak as he drove, his expression serious, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. They both knew what was at stake. Every step they took was one closer to either bringing Anthony Cartwright down or becoming another casualty in his ruthless game. Jada took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The list Nick had given her felt like a lifeline, but she also knew it could be a trap. Every name on it could either be an ally or an enemy. How would she know who to trust? "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice calm despite the storm raging in her mind. Riggins glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "We go after the people who are closest to Cartwright. People who have the most to lose if he falls. That's where the real power lies." Jada nodded. She didn't need to be told twice. Cartwright's network was vast, and finding the key players would be the only way to break him down from the inside. But the challenge was identifying those players without tipping off Cartwright or his people. They pulled into a rundown parking garage several blocks away from the cafe, parking in a dark corner where no one could easily spot them. Riggins turned to Jada. "We need to be careful. These people will be watching us. Don't talk to anyone unless I say it's okay." Jada nodded. "Got it." She was ready. They both stepped out of the car, and Riggins led the way through the parking garage toward a narrow alley that ran between two old buildings. It was an area that looked abandoned, but Jada could feel eyes on them. They were being watched. "Stick close," Riggins muttered, his voice low but urgent. "We're meeting someone who can give us more information. A former associate of Cartwright's. He's been on a run for a while now, but he's desperate. If we can find him, he'll talk." The alley smelled of mildew and old garbage, the walls covered in graffiti and peeling posters. They walked in silence, but the tension was suffocating. Each footstep echoed, and Jada couldn't help but feel like they were walking into a trap. They reached the end of the alley and turned into another narrow street. This one was quieter, with fewer people around, but that only heightened Jada's sense of danger. It was too quiet. Riggins stopped in front of a small building that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were boarded up, the door cracked open just enough for someone to slip through. Riggins knocked 3 times, then waited. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing a man with a weathered face and unkempt hair. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a torn jacket and faded jeans. His eyes darted nervously from Riggins to Jada before he stepped aside to let them in. "You're late," he grumbled. Riggins gave a sharp nod and walked inside, Jada following close behind. The room they entered was dimly lit, with barely enough space to move. There was a small table in the center, covered in papers and empty coffee cups. The man, whose name was Paul, took a seat and motioned for them to do the same. "I don't have much time," Paul said in a hushed voice. "Cartwright's people are on to me. I barely made it out of the city alive. You're lucky I'm still here." Riggins didn't waste any time. "We need information. We need to know everything you can tell us about Cartwright's operation. His inner circle, his connections, anything you know." Paul hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I can give you some names," he said slowly. "But be careful. Cartwright's got spies everywhere. You can't trust anyone." Jada leaned forward. "We're not leaving until we get what we need. Start talking." Paul exhaled sharply, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right. Cartwright's got a guy named Frank Miller. He's the one who handles all the dirty work, the hits, the enforcers, the muscle. If you want to get close to Cartwright, you need to start with him." Riggins's eyes flashed. "Where do we find him?" Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He's got a club, a strip joint on the outskirts of town. It's a front. The real business goes on behind closed doors. If you want to get a Cartwright, you go through Miller." Jada felt a chill crawl up her spine. Everything about this felt like walking straight into the lion's den. But it was the only lead they had. "And what about Cartwright himself?" Jada asked. "Where is he hiding? How do we get to him?" Paul shook his head. "Cartwright doesn't come out in public much. Too risky. He's got a private estate in the hills, but it's guarded like Fort Knox. I don't think anyone's gotten close to him in years. You'll need more than guts to get to him." Riggins's jaw tightened. "We'll figure it out." Jada looked at Riggins, then back at Paul. "Any other names on the list?" Paul paused, his expression darkening. "I don't know them all, but I can tell you this. Cartwright's got people in every part of the city, law enforcement, politicians, even the media. No one is clean. Everyone's on his payroll." Jada's stomach turned. Cartwright had built an empire on corruption, one that reached deeper into the city's core than she had ever imagined. "I think that's enough," Riggins said, standing up. "Get out of town, Paul. If they find you here, it's over." Paul nodded, his face grim. "Good luck. You're going to need it." They left the building quickly, the sense of urgency growing stronger with every passing moment. As they stepped back into the street, Jada looked at Riggins. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're about to walk into a war zone." Riggins's expression was grim. "Yes, and we don't have much time before Cartwright finds out we're coming for him." Jada took a deep breath. "Then let's make it count." They didn't look back as they got into the car, but Jada couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Everything was changing, and there was no turning back now. The war had started. The city was alive with tension. Jada could feel it in the air, in the way people moved, in the way the shadows stretched long and deep. Every step she took felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that this was it. There was no turning back now. She and Riggins sat in the car outside Frank Miller's club, their expressions grim. The neon lights flashed above them, flickering between red and blue, casting eerie glows across the darkened street. Inside that building was the key to Anthony Cartwright's empire. Miller was the enforcer, the one who made sure things got done. And if they were going to get to Cartwright, they had to go through him first. Jada inhaled sharply, gripping the gun Riggins had given her. She had never wanted to be the kind of person who needed one. But this wasn't about what she wanted anymore. It was about survival. You ready? Riggins asked, his voice low. Jada nodded. Let's do this. They stepped out of the car and moved toward the entrance. The bouncers at the door barely glanced at them before letting them inside. The music was deafening, the bass shaking the walls. Women danced under flashing lights. Men in expensive suits sat in booths, sipping whiskey and exchanging hushed conversations. Jada spotted him immediately. Frank Miller. He was sitting in a VIP section, surrounded by bodyguards. His presence was undeniable. He had the air of a man who knew he was untouchable. But tonight, that was going to change. Riggins leaned in close. We don't have much time. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that someone tips Cartwright off. Jada squared her shoulders. Then let's not waste it. She walked straight toward Miller, ignoring the way the guards shifted as she approached. One of them stepped forward, blocking her path. Back off. You don't have an appointment. Jada didn't blink. Tell your boss that Jada Simmons is here to talk. The guard's expression flickered. Recognition, maybe surprise, but then he turned and whispered something to Miller. Miller glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a lazy wave of his hand, he motioned for his guards to step aside. Jada and Riggins walked in. Miller leaned back in his seat, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. Well, he drawled. If it isn't the girl who should be rotting in a cell right now. Jada clenched her jaw. But I'm not. And you know why? Because your boss failed. Miller smirked. You think you're here to win? He leaned forward, his eyes dark. Cartwright already knows you're coming. You think he'd let you waltz in here and threaten his operation? Jada's stomach tightened. He was expecting them. This had been a setup all along. She barely had time to react before the club's music cut off abruptly. The chatter died, the air thick with tension. Then the doors slammed open. A dozen men in dark suits filed in. Armed. Silent. Their presence alone sent a chill down Jada's spine. And then the last man walked in. Anthony Cartwright. He was older than she expected, but his presence was suffocating. He exuded power in a way that made the entire room seem smaller, like he was the only one who truly mattered. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto her. Jada had never felt fear like this before. Cartwright gave a slow smile, stepping closer. I have to admit, he said smoothly, I didn't think you'd make it this far. Jada forced herself to stand tall. You tried to frame me. You tried to kill me. But I'm still here. Cartwright chuckled. For now. Riggins tensed beside her, his hand hovering near his weapon. But Cartwright simply raised a hand, and his men aimed their guns at them. Easy, Cartwright said. No need for violence, just yet. Jada's mind raced. There was no way out. No escape. They had walked right into his hands. But then, something changed. The club's doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't Cartwright's men. It was Monroe. And behind him, an entire squad of federal agents. Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out. Cartwright's men scrambled, some trying to fight, others trying to flee. Riggins grabbed Jada, pulling her down behind cover as bullets ripped through the air. Miller went down first, a clean shot to the chest. Cartwright tried to run, but Monroe was faster. Jada watched as Monroe tackled him to the ground, pressing a gun to the side of his head. It's over, Cartwright, Monroe growled. For the first time, Jada saw fear in the man's eyes. It was over. She exhaled shakily, the weight of everything crashing over her. The nightmare that had begun with a single lie, Briggs's lie, had finally come to an end. The police swarmed the building, arresting what remained of Cartwright's empire. Riggins helped her to her feet, his face unreadable. You all right? Jada looked around, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. She had survived. She had fought. And she had won. Monroe approached her, nodding. You did good, Jada. She studied him, remembering the doubt she had felt about him. But in the end, he had come through. She gave him a small, tired smile. So did you. Cartwright was hauled to his feet by two officers, his face contorted with rage. He looked at Jada, his eyes filled with unspoken threats. This isn't over, he hissed. Jada met his gaze, unflinching. Yes, it is. And with that, He was dragged away. Jada felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she was free. No more running. No more fear. She had fought for her name, for her life, and she had won. As she stepped outside, breathing in the crisp night air, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It was over.